Ulia Pagel, Secretary General of Network of European Museum Organization. So you all see the presentation, I think. Yeah?
That's it. Thank you. So just one little introduction to show you where we might be. We are what I call in the curve, and it's maybe more appropriate to show where we are, not in a crisis anymore, but in the middle of a pandemic. And even though countries are slowly opening up and the museums, as we've heard already, that doesn't mean that the pandemic is over. I think what this graph says is that we have to deal with the situation for a very long time. Less visitors, incredible amount of safety features and rules, but at least they are open. So what we are planning for today and for the next time to come is essential when we think of replacing the museums in the public eye. And I think this is very important to think about. Next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah, as you might know, NEMO has conducted a survey to document and analyze the impact of the coronavirus situation on museums in Europe. I would like to share some of the insights with you, a lot about the economic impact, but also some findings which point us to digital opportunities for museums to reach new audiences and their visibility. This whole survey is available for free on our website if you want to dig deeper into the details. Short introduction to the survey. So it was almost 1,000 museums responding until 30th of April from 48 countries, and most of them coming from the EU. And maybe also just to say that this information is from late mid-March to the end of April. So some of the information has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because as you know, in this coronavirus situation, a new reality exists every day, and what we thought was relevant last week might not be relevant next week. So just to let you know. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the survey results in a nutshell. Most museums, and not only in Europe, but across the globe, closed their doors until early May. Majority of museums in European countries are opening up, but we'll come back to that later. This is the first overview of the income loss, and I think Peter has already said this. A lot of museums have found their budget quite impacted. Some of the museums haven't, but some of them, especially the larger ones, the ones in touristic areas, have reported a loss of income of 75 to 80% per week, and the big museums losing more than hundreds of thousands of euros per week. Next slide, please. I think it was also quite interesting to see that museums in capitals are most affected by the loss of income, which is not so surprising as they're the ones benefiting most from tourists, and also they have a greater population density. And another clear tendency, if you look at the lower graph, is that privately run museums lose more money than state-funded museums do in comparison. And this also correlates with the feedback that we had, that the majority of museums that fear permanent closure are privately funded museums. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So how have museums reacted to this situation? I think in general, museums have been quite quick, and we also heard that from the previous speakers, and also proactive in their response to the pandemic. They've shifted their focus to addressing needs with the community. They have collected objects and stories from people to preserve that moment. They've donated masks and gloves to hospitals. They've increased digital services. And if you look at the staff and human resources, I think the good news, at least according to our survey, which really focuses on the museums in the EU member states, is that the majority of museums have not had to lay off staff as by now. So more than 60% of the museums report that they have changed staff tasks to accommodate current needs. And also a substantial number of museums have put their contracts with freelancers on hold, and most of the museums have stopped their volunteer programs entirely. And this we also heard previously by Wenke. Many museum educators are freelance, and this has impacted them heavily. Next slide, please. So a bit of a good news, more than 60% of the museums have increased their online presence, or they have started a new service, which means that they have started an online service which the museum didn't run before. And the creative solution to cater for this new digital offer was to shift these staff tasks. And they did that within the shortest amount of time, which I think is very good news for museums which normally have this, where you normally have the idea that they are very slow in adapting. 30% of the, one bit, 30% of the museums have changed staff tasks to the digital bit, and 13% have added resources to online activities, which in times where the budgets are shrinking is, I think, a very bold decision to take. Next slide, please. Yeah, we also had a look at the input-output relation with regard to digital museum services. So not surprisingly, the museums that reallocated staff tasks, which is the little yellow circles, are the most active in starting new online services or increasing existing services, which are the little red diamonds and green triangles. Next slide, please. And this graph shows you that the services that do not require additional financial resources or experiences and skills are the ones increasing most. So for example, hashtags or activities around an already existing online collection do not require more resources or specific knowledge and skills from staff. But services that, for example, podcasts, live content, online learning that require A, time, and B, money, are the ones that have least increased. And I think those two slides just illustrate very clearly that without input, we will not have any more output. Next slide, please. Yeah, not surprisingly, the museums that were able to reallocate resources also noticed an increase in online visitors. 41% of the museums reported an increase in digital visitors, which generally responded to the increase in digital services provided. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting to see that museums increased their online activity from day one of their closure. But, and this is why I show you the two pie charts, is that after realizing that the online activity was really successful, they even increased their digital activity more. So the second graph is from the second part, so in April, and the first graph is from the March bit. And this also translates, translates in increased online visits. You can see that museums reported that they have had an increase in digital visitors from 10 to up to 150%. Next slide, please. Yeah, and when you look at the demand side, when we ask for what people were most interested in digital services, then next to social media, it was educational materials and videos and films. So I think this is really something that museums need to take home, and this is something where they need to invest in the future. Unfortunately, this doesn't come without added resources and skills. So this is what we also have to think about and demand from fund givers. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this argument is also supported by a recent hack, a post from a colleague who looked at the virtual museum tours in Google Trends. And by the time that all the museums closed their doors, the virtual museum tours were very high up on the agenda, but then it gradually decreased. So looking at something that is more than just a virtual tour of a physical exhibition is, I think, crucial when we think about new formats that we have to include here. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think many of you have seen this example already, and as Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza, who had just opened their Rembrandt exhibition when the museum had to close due to the COVID crisis. So they came up with an online exhibition with curators' talks and individual apps around. And they, next slide please, have increased their online visitors compared to the year before by 50 to 60%, which is a real opportunity to connect to new audiences as well. Next slide, please. Just to give you some ideas, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna has a great feature which allows to take a look behind the scenes at X-ray images, backsides of works and unknown details. And in an interactive way, you can slip into the role of a superhero or a queen, create a monster, send a bouquet of flowers to the one you love. And there are specific stories for children. So they have really stepped up their game here. Next slide. Actually, the next 3 slides, Lana, if you can just slip through. We've all seen those worldwide between art and quarantine works and museum from home hashtags, where museums are involved, like the Getty, the Louvre, the Kunsthalle Bremen, where the idea is to enact works from collections of different museums, and people shared these pictures on all the different online platforms. I think, by the way, that this is maybe the most important bit, is that these initiatives were by far the most successful on the internet. And these were the ones where museums provided their pictures just to leave it completely curated by the public. So this is also something that museums need to take back home when thinking about how they want to attract new audiences. Next slide, please. Yeah, and last but not least, as an example of a museum collecting objects and stories and ideas of museums during Corona, this is the Museum of European Cultures in Berlin that has started this initiative and has gotten a lot of feedback during this time. So next slide, please. Yeah, so now when we look at NEMO's map of reopening back up to the public, I think we should recognize that there is no fast track back to normal, or rather than doing this step back to normal, we should learn from the crisis and adapt. And everybody has said this already. The question is, how do we do that? I would like to end with a very nice example of museums in Latvia. Next slide, please. Who ran a joint public information campaign. So it's a national information campaign with the hashtag Let's Meet Now, after the hashtag We'll Meet Soon, when the museums had to close. So for the time being, in many museums, a uniform design changed the appearance of museums and showed them as one community. As you can see, the visual identity of the campaign paraphrases the pictogram of the internationally known sign Fragile Handle with Care. But this time it looks at the fragility of human life. In addition, there is a single platform which is called musei.lv, which publishes regular updates on museums already open, notifies the public about their offers, and informs them about any kind of restrictions. I thought it was very interesting that the museums decided to do a step together and kind of looked as one sector opening up and giving people the feeling that they are a safe place to visit altogether. Next slide, please. Yeah, well, and what is the Museum of the New Future? I think the focus of museums to relate and address the immediate communities will become much more important in the coming time. There will hardly be any travel, hardly be any tourists, and that means that as a museum, you really need to be more relevant to the people surrounding you. And this new reality of welcoming only a fraction of the physical visitors to the museum, and the safety measures to guarantee safe visits, and I think OECD has predicted 50 to 70% decrease of global tourism, means that digital offers that have sparked during the crisis will clearly maintain their importance on the long term. but this also means heavy investment in and the increase of digital formats and offers, and also the investment in this digital literacy of staff. And also on the museum side, because now we are almost and always talking about the funding aspect, but I think it also requires the will to transform on the museum level. To a museum that thinks digital across all services and departments, investing in capacity building of staff, and invests in what museums are unique for, their collections and their rich content. Next slide, please. Our report ends with some recommendations on a policy level, which are looking at 3 areas particularly: at the economic support for museum operations, at investment for the digital cultural heritage, what I was just referring to, and in making museums fit for crisis. And I thought it was very interesting that everybody speaking before, Wenke, Diana, Corey, Peter, was referring to the fact that we all have to, that they all needed the collaboration and the exchange with the colleagues during this time. So I think transnational collaboration and learning from each other and benchmarking and creating a common voice for causes is really important in this time, and networks like all of these networks we're standing for are really important in this. Museums are really no islands anymore, and like any other work they're happening in a global context. So these recommendations go to governments at all levels, but also to private funders, and obviously they also go to the museums. So it's also about the museums to take the next step and really make a change. Thank you. Now, next slide, and thank you. Which is this very nice slide, by the way, of all those museums looking at the security measures. They're really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.